The clinking of silverware had barely faded when Lucas stood up, his glass of wine still in hand. I knew that tone before he even opened his mouth, the one he used when he was about to play judge, jury, and executioner. "We've come to a decision," he announced, his eyes colder than the snow falling outside my Aspen home. Amelia glanced at her husband like this was some corporate coup, and Ryan wouldn't even look at me, just stared at his Rolex like time was running out on his little charade. I set down the carving knife, my hand steady even though my heart slammed against my ribs. "You're no longer part of this family," Lucas said. And just like that, 30 years of sacrifice of love that cost me everything vanished like smoke from the fireplace behind me. The silence was deafening. My grandchildren froze mid-bite fork, suspended in the air, as if the entire room couldn't breathe. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been waiting for this moment, planning for it. And in less than 5 minutes, the world they thought they controlled would burn to the ground. It's funny how betrayal tastes like cinnamon and cloves. That's what I thought as I stared at the table I'd spent 2 days perfecting, roasted prime rib resting on a silver platter, garlic mashed potatoes piped into swirls, tiny sugared cranberries glistening like rubies in crystal bowls. My dining room looked like a spread from an Aspen luxury magazine. And why wouldn't it? This house, this life, this illusion of family harmony, I had curated it all. For them. For the people who now sat across from me, plotting my erasure while savoring the last bites of a meal they didn't deserve. Lucas remained standing, his jaw set with that self-righteous confidence he'd perfected in law school. Amelia leaned back, smirking, like this was some reality TV drama, and she was the star. Ryan, the baby who once clung to my skirts, kept scrolling on his phone as if this entire ambush was just a minor inconvenience between his ski trips and poker nights. "Do you have anything to say?" Lucas asked, finally, his voice dripping with authority he didn't earn. I dabbed the corner of my lips with a linen napkin, folded it neatly, and looked up at him. Calm, controlled, the kind of calm that terrifies people who expect you to break. "Yes," I said softly, "I do. 3 words. That was all." Enough to make Amelia's smirk falter, enough to pull Ryan's eyes from his glowing screen. Lucas, though, he just tilted his head, mistaking my composure for surrender. But surrender was the last thing on my mind. For months, I'd felt this storm brewing. The hushed phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. The sudden concern about my well-being, their gentle suggestions that maybe I should sell the house, move into something manageable, maybe even a retirement community. I'd smiled through every conversation, nodding like the oblivious matriarch they thought I was. All the while, I was preparing. They believed they were playing chess. They had no idea I'd switched the game to poker, and I was holding the winning hand. As Lucas launched into his well-rehearsed speech about family consensus and future planning, I tuned out the words and focused on the faces. Lucas, always the strategist, tried to look noble, as though cutting me out of their lives was an act of mercy. Amelia, queen of passive aggression, adjusted her diamond bracelet, a Christmas gift from me, naturally, while throwing quick glances at her husband, who stared at his plate like he wanted to vanish. And Ryan, sweet spoiled Ryan, his leg bounced under the table, betraying the nerves he couldn't quite hide. They thought tonight was their grand finale. They had no idea it was only the opening act. I let Lucas finish, let Amelia add her venom-laced commentary, let Ryan mumble something about how this is for the best, Mom. When the silence finally settled, I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips that made Amelia's perfectly Botoxed forehead crease. "Interesting," I said, as if they just suggested switching to almond milk. "You've all been very busy." Lucas blinked. "This isn't personal, Mom. It's about what's best for everyone. For everyone. Translation for them. So they could slice up my life like the turkey I'd carved 2 hours earlier." I rose from my chair, smoothing the deep green velvet of my dress. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the floor-to-ceiling windows, the mountains rising dark against the star-pierced sky. A picture-perfect Christmas night fitting, really, for what was about to happen. "Since we're sharing decisions tonight," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand, "I have a little something for you, too." I reached for the clutch resting on the sideboard, a classic black Hermes, understated but worth more than Ryan's car payment. From it, I pulled 3 envelopes, gold, heavy, sealed with crimson wax stamped with a V. One for Lucas, one for Amelia, one for Ryan. Their eyes locked on the envelopes like cats spotting a snake. "Merry Christmas," I said, laying them gently on the table. "Open them. Together." And as they reached for those envelopes with trembling fingers, I felt it, the shift in the room, the subtle crack in their confidence, the first tremor before the avalanche. Lucas hesitated before sliding his finger under the wax seal. Amelia tore hers open with the impatience of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. Ryan just stared at his envelope like it might bite him. "Go on," I urged, taking my seat again with deliberate elegance. "You wanted to make tonight unforgettable. So did I." They exchanged wary glances, a silent conversation bouncing across the polished mahogany table. Lucas nodded first, always the leader in their conspiracies. He unfolded the thick parchment, his lawyer's eyes scanning the words with clinical precision until they didn't, until his face drained of color. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked like ice splitting on a frozen lake. Amelia looked up from her own letter, her lips parting in disbelief. Ryan muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. "Oh," I said softly, savoring the moment. "That's just the beginning." As their world began to tilt, mine rewound, 30 years of memories flashing like film reels behind my eyes. I remembered the girl I was before all this Victoria Monroe 22, fresh out of college, thinking life was a fairy tale waiting to happen. I'd grown up in Texas, a preacher's daughter, with a trust in people so deep it bordered on dangerous. Then came Charles Davenport, a name that opened doors in every city, a man 15 years older who made wealth look like an art form. He swept me into a life of ski lodges and gala dinners, convincing me I was Cinderella and this was my glass slipper. We built this Aspen estate together, at least that's what I believed. In reality, Charles built it for himself and for the legacy he worshipped more than any god. When our struggles with infertility began, I cried for nights blaming myself, begging for another chance to give him the family he craved. Charles never yelled, never struck me. His weapons were quieter, sharper, disappointment disguised as logic, love conditioned on performance. "We'll try other options," he said, like our marriage was a failing investment. Those options became 3 private adoptions arranged entirely through his legal contacts. He told me they were babies from mothers who wanted anonymity. I believed him because love makes fools of us all. Lucas, Amelia, Ryan. I loved them fiercely from the moment I held them. Birthday parties that rivaled royalty ski trips, Ivy League tuition, everything they wanted, I delivered. And for years, I thought that love would circle back like a boomerang. I was wrong. When Charles died 5 years ago, I stood by his casket and promised myself 2 things. I would keep the family together, and I would never let money make us strangers. How ironic that both promises turned to ash before my eyes. Lucas slammed the envelope down, his composure fracturing like a cracked mirror. "This is a joke," he said. "Tell me this is some kind of sick—" "It's not a joke." I interrupted, my tone silk over steel. "Everything in those documents is legal, binding, irrevocable." "What documents?" Ryan's voice trembled as he shuffled through the pages like they might rearrange themselves if he flipped fast enough. "Oh, just a few minor updates," I said lightly. "Revocations of financial privileges, termination of access to certain trust accounts, and of course my revised estate plan. Effective immediately." Amelia's diamond bracelet caught the firelight as her hand shook. You cut us out." "Completely not just out," I said, leaning forward. "Erased. As if you never existed." The silence that followed was glorious, thick with disbelief and dawning horror. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains, rattling the frosted windows like a drum roll for destruction. "You can't do this," Lucas whispered, but there was no conviction left in his voice. "Can't I?" I tilted my head, meeting his gaze with a calmness that came from months of preparation. "I've consulted the best legal minds in the country. Every I dotted, every T crossed. The adoption records, well, let's just say they contain certain irregularities that give me flexibility. I let that hang in the air like the scent of gunpowder. Their eyes widened, but I wasn't ready to detonate the full truth yet. Not tonight. Tonight was about giving them a taste of what power really feels like when the hand holding it isn't theirs. As they sputtered and scrambled for words, I thought of all the nights I'd sat alone in this cavernous house, staring at the snow while my phone stayed silent. No calls, no visits except when they needed something. Money for Ryan's business ventures, which I later learned were poker debts. A down payment on Amelia's second home in Palm Springs. Lucas's endless requests for short-term liquidity that conveniently coincided with his Vegas trips. I gave and gave and gave until the giving felt like bleeding out by degrees. They weren't my children anymore. They were parasites in designer shoes, so I hired a private investigator, a woman named Margaret ex-FBI, sharp as a scalpel. While they were busy plotting my removal, I was busy cataloging every skeleton in their walk-in closets. Lucas, my golden boy lawyer, was siphoning client funds to feed a gambling addiction that had already cost him a fortune. Amelia, the perfect daughter, was forging my signature on checks and funneling cash to cover shopping sprees and an affair with her tennis instructor. And Ryan, sweet baby Ryan, was knee-deep in cocaine distribution using shell companies registered under my name. By the time Margaret handed me her final report, I didn't feel shock, just clarity. Clarity and an odd, exhilarating sense of freedom, because now I held the one thing none of them could buy, charm, or manipulate out of me: leverage. I rose from the table again, the train of my velvet gown whispering against the Persian rug. You know, I said softly, almost to myself, family is such a fragile thing, built on trust, shattered by greed. Amelia stood too, her chair scraping across the hardwood like a scream. You can't just erase us, Mother, after everything we've done. I laughed then, a low melodic laugh that rolled through the room like distant thunder. Everything you've done, I repeated. Darling, you have no idea what you've done, but you will. I moved toward the fireplace, the heat painting my skin in shades of vengeance. Behind me, voices rose, Lucas demanding explanations, Ryan cursing Amelia, hurling threats dressed as pleas. I tuned them out, focused instead on the flames licking the logs, devouring everything they touched. Fire doesn't negotiate, neither do I. When I turned back, I saw at the first glimmer of fear in Lucas's eyes, and that more than any legal document or frozen bank account was my Christmas miracle. I walked back to the head of the table, heels clicking like a metronome for their panic. Do you know what fascinates me? I asked, resting my hands lightly on the carved mahogany. How people mistake kindness for weakness. You thought I was soft, predictable, that you could humiliate me, strip me of everything I built, and I'd thank you for the privilege. Ryan slammed his fist against the table, rattling the crystal goblets. You can't just cut us off. Everything we have, everything you have, came from Dad. You didn't earn any of this. I met his outburst with the calm of a woman who's already buried the old version of herself. You're right, I said, voice low but lethal. Your father built this empire, and I protected it while he was alive and after he was gone. I could have burned through it years ago. Instead, I kept it intact. For you. For all of you. But tonight, watching you plot my exile over prime rib, that was the moment I realized something: I don't owe you a damn thing. Lucas opened his mouth, then shut it. For the first time all evening, the words failed him. Amelia just stood there, her perfect manicure trembling as she gripped the edge of the table like it was a lifeline. I gave you everything, I continued, my voice steady as a blade sliding across velvet. Your childhoods, your education, your homes. And in return, you gave me ultimatums. Congratulations, you just freed me from every last obligation. Effective immediately. I let that sink in, savoring the silence heavy with rage, shock, and something deliciously satisfying: fear. Outside, the snow kept falling silent and relentless, covering the world in white. A clean slate. As I moved toward the grand staircase, I paused, looking back at the three people who used to be my whole universe. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said, my lips curving into a smile sharp enough to draw blood. It's going to be one you'll never forget. And with that, I left them standing in a room that no longer belonged to them in a life that never will again. I didn't go upstairs to cry. I didn't collapse in some melodramatic heap like they probably expected. No, I went straight to the study, my sanctuary. The one room in this entire house that still felt like mine. The fire crackled in the stone hearth as I closed the double doors, shutting out the muffled chaos of Ray's voices behind me. My fingers grazed the mahogany desk Charles had imported from Florence, the same desk where I'd signed countless checks, trust agreements, and college applications. For years, I believed this room was the heart of our family's legacy. What I didn't know was that it also held its darkest secret. I poured myself a Scotch neat, just like Charles used to drink, and let the burn steady me. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out the leather-bound journal where I'd started documenting everything months ago. Names, dates, phone calls, wire transfers, a breadcrumb trail of betrayal meticulously recorded in my handwriting. Because if my children thought tonight was the end of the story, they were dead wrong. It all started last Thanksgiving. Another perfect dinner in another perfect year or so, it seemed. The table groaned under turkey and truffle mashed potatoes crystal, catching the glow of candlelight. My children laughed and drank and posted curated snapshots of family bliss to Instagram. And then between the pumpkin pie and coffee, Lucas cleared his throat. Mom, he began wearing that earnest expression that could sell lies for gold. We've been talking. It's time we had a serious conversation about your future. I set down the silver pie server, already sensing the script they'd rehearsed. Downsizing, assisted living, something more suitable for your age. They couched it in concern, but the subtext was clear. You're in the way. That night after the last dish was washed and the house was silent, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the dark, staring at the twinkling lights on the Christmas tree I'd put up early. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding for years. What if my children don't love me at all? What if they only love what I can give them? By dawn, the answer was echoing in my bones. So I made a decision. If they wanted a war, they'd get one, but it would be on my terms. The first step was information. Power doesn't come from money, it comes from knowledge. So I hired a private investigator, Margaret Cho, ex-FBI, 30 years in the Bureau, the kind of woman who could peel back a life layer by layer until she reached the marrow. I'll never forget our first meeting. A discreet corner booth at a steakhouse in Denver, the air thick with cigar smoke and secrets. Mrs. Davenport, she said, sliding a black notebook across the table. If you hire me, you need to be ready for whatever I find, even if it destroys you. Margaret, I replied, my voice steady, though my heart hammered in my chest. I've already been destroyed. I just haven't held the pieces yet. She smiled, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. Then let's start picking them up. Within weeks, Margaret's updates started coming in. At first, I braced for little things, credit card splurges, petty lies, maybe a gambling debt or two. But what she uncovered was darker than anything I'd imagined. Lucas, my firstborn, the golden boy, the one I used to rock to sleep under a quilt my mother made, was living a double life. His Vegas conferences were nothing but high-stakes poker marathons that bled him dry. To cover his losses, he'd begun siphoning funds from client accounts at his law firm, embezzlement, a felony that would end his career and land him in prison if exposed. Amelia wasn't any better. My elegant, Instagram-perfect daughter had turned forgery into an art form. She'd been stealing from the grandkids' education funds, funneling the money into designer sprees and hush-hush romantic getaways with her personal trainer. The woman who lectured me about responsible aging was committing fraud in 6-inch Louboutins. And Ryan, sweet baby Ryan, my sunshine, my boy with the crooked smile and endless charm, he was the darkest of them all. Cocaine distribution, money laundering, shell companies registered under my name. If the feds came knocking, it wouldn't be his door, they'd come for me. I remember sitting in this very study the night Margaret handed me the final report, the paper trembling in my hands. Shock gave way to something colder, harder, not grief. Grief is for the innocent. This was clarity. Pure, brutal clarity. For 30 years, I believed love was enough, that if I gave my children everything security, privilege, unconditional devotion, they'd give me loyalty in return. I was wrong. What they gave me was exploitation wrapped in gratitude's costume. And so while they plotted my removal, I began plotting their reckoning. Step 1. Secure my future. I called Amanda Brooks a bulldog of an estate attorney who didn't flinch when I laid everything on the table. You want to disinherit them completely? She asked, arching one perfectly penciled brow. Not just disinherit, I said. Erase. I want every tie severed, every loophole closed. If they so much as breathe in my direction after this, I want the law on my side. Amanda leaned back, a slow smile spreading across her face. Mrs. Davenport, I think I'm going to enjoy working with you. Step 2. Assemble my arsenal. Copies of every incriminating document Margaret dug up, bank records, signed affidavits, photos of Amelia in a Cabo villa with a man who definitely wasn't her husband, audio of Ryan bragging in a Denver bar about his mommy-funded empire. Enough evidence to bury them under federal indictments for the next decade. Step 3. Wait, smile, host dinners, play the part of the clueless matriarch while setting the stage for the ultimate reveal. Christmas seemed poetic. I drained the last of my scotch, the fire painting my reflection in shades of amber and shadow. Tomorrow, the avalanche would start. By New Year's, my children would understand the cost of betrayal and the price of underestimating me. And yet, as I closed the journal and slipped it back into the drawer, a strange calm washed over me. Not triumph, not vengeance, something quieter, something like freedom. Because here's the truth, no one tells you. The day you stop begging people to value you is the day you reclaim your power. Tonight I'd stop begging. Tomorrow I'd start living. The night after Thanksgiving, sleep abandoned me. I roamed this house like a ghost, padding through hallways lined with oil portraits and Christmas wreaths, everything immaculate, everything meaningless. I paused in front of the family photo over the grand piano, Lucas in his Harvard sweatshirt, Amelia in pearls, Ryan flashing that devil-may-care grin. My children, my legacy, my reason for breathing. Or so I thought. Something in Margaret's report kept gnawing at me, a detail so small it felt almost irrelevant at first. Adoption, paperwork, inconsistencies, duplicate signatures, medical records that didn't align. Margaret flagged them as unusual, but didn't press, assuming I knew the full story. I didn't, but I was about to. At 2:00 a.m., I slipped into Charles's study. I hadn't touched this room since the funeral. His leather chair still smelled faintly of his cologne, a blend of cedar and control. My fingers trailed over the glass front cabinets, past rows of law books and vintage scotch, until they stopped at a steel lockbox tucked behind a row of leather-bound volumes. I knew the combination. Of course I did. 30 years of marriage teaches you things like how men who pride themselves on secrets always hide them in plain sight. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt like a verdict. Inside files, neat labeled damning, birth certificates, court documents, letters on heavy cream stationery from a law firm I didn't recognize. My pulse roared in my ears as I opened the first folder. And just like that, the life I thought I lived disintegrated in my hands. Lucas Davenport, birth date correct. Place of birth, Portland, Oregon, not the Midwest Hospital. Charles swore he'd driven me to in a snowstorm for the private adoption. Biological parents, Charles Davenport and Diana Blackwood. Diana, a name that felt like glass on my tongue. Folder 2. Amelia, same story. Folder 3. Ryan. Again. All 3 children weren't adopted strangers. They were Charles's blood, his children, from another woman. The woman he told me had run off. The woman I now learned had died in a car accident when Ryan was barely 1 year old. My knees buckled. I sank into his chair, the papers trembling in my grip, bile burning my throat. 30 years. 30 years of baking birthday cakes, soothing fevers, staying up nights worrying about SAT scores, believing I was building a family from scratch. I wasn't a mother, I was a stand-in, a placeholder. Charles slotted into Diana's vacancy because the courts were circling, and he needed a respectable wife to lock down custody. Every memory rewound and replays itself in cruel clarity. The way he insisted on handling the adoptions personally, his obsession with airtight legal protections, the clauses in the trust that never quite made sense. I thought it was about shielding the kids from scandal. It wasn't, it was about shielding him from me. The next folder gutted me even deeper correspondence between Charles and his lawyers, lines that seared into my brain. Ensure Victoria remains unaware of the true parentage. Her role is critical for stability during early years. Amend estate provisions to prioritize bloodline continuity above spousal claims. Translation: I wasn't a wife. I was a nanny with a wedding band, a legal shield to keep Diana's parents from taking the children he stole. Because buried in that same folder were court filings from Oregon, a custody battle that never happened, because Charles vanished with the kids before the hearing. He didn't adopt them, he abducted them. My vision blurred, hot tears cutting tracks down my cheeks. 30 years, 30 years of living in a fairy tale scripted by a man who treated me like a convenience. And now, those same children, the ones I mothered with, every breath in my body wanted me gone, erased, just like their father always planned. I pressed a fist to my mouth to keep from screaming. Outside, the snow kept falling silent, relentless mocking. At 5 near a.m., I poured myself another scotch and called Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. Victoria, what's wrong? Everything, I whispered. Everything is a lie. I told her about the files, the DNA implications, the custody battle Charles buried under layers of legal deceit. There was a long pause on the other end. Do you want me to dig deeper? No, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. I want you to find them, find who, the Blackwoods. Her parents, the family Charles stole from. Another pause, then understood. Margaret didn't ask why. That's what I loved about her. She just got things done. By Christmas Eve, she delivered. James and Margaret Blackwood, Portland, Oregon, late 80s, still alive, still searching. For 30 years, they'd been leaving breadcrumbs across the country, ads in legal journals, private investigators, open-ended pleas in genealogy databases, all hoping for a miracle. When I heard their voices on the phone quivering with gratitude, disbelief, and decades of unspent love, I felt something fracture inside me. These weren't strangers. These were the people who should have been grandparents to Lucas, Amelia, and Ryan, the ones Charles erased like typos in a contract. And here's the cruelest twist of all: they still wanted them. After everything, after decades of silence and lies, they still prayed every night for those kids. The same kids plotting to ship me off to a retirement home like last season's handbag. That was the moment my grief calcified into purpose. Betrayal had burned me down to ash, but from that ash, something new rose. Not revenge, justice, cold surgical biblical in its precision. If my children didn't want me as their mother, fine. I'd give them what they wanted. I'd cut the cord so clean they'd never find where it had been tied. But I wouldn't stop there. I'd make sure they faced every truth they'd spent their lives avoiding about themselves, about their father, about the empire built on a foundation of stolen blood and borrowed time. I'd spent 3 decades begging for love. Now I'd settle for something far more satisfying: respect delivered in screams across a mahogany table. And so the plan crystallized. The envelopes, the evidence, the legal petitions Amanda filed with the ruthless elegance of a scalpel sliding between ribs. By the time the clock struck midnight on Christmas Eve, everything was locked, notarized, and irrevocable. Tomorrow my children would sit down to the most exquisite dinner I'd ever prepared. And by dessert, I'd serve them the truth raw, bloody, and garnished with the consequences they earned. I closed the lockbox, my hand steady now, and whispered into the empty study, "Merry Christmas, Charles. I hope you're watching, because tomorrow your perfect little bloodline learns what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman." Christmas Day dawned sharp and cold, the kind of Colorado morning where the sky feels carved from glass and every breath slices like a blade. I woke before sunrise, not because of nerves those had burned out weeks ago, but because power demands ritual, and today was a ritual of endings. I dressed with deliberate care. Burgundy velvet deep enough to drink light, a diamond brooch Charles once gave me after winning a case so lucrative he called it career-defining. My hair swept into a chignon, each strand lacquered into submission. When I looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back, regal, remote, untouchable. Perfect. By noon, the house smelled like nostalgia, prime rib slow roasting rosemary, and thyme perfuming the air, Yorkshire pudding rising in golden swells. I'd spent 2 days creating this meal, every garnish a dagger wrapped in silk. The table glittered under crystal chandeliers, bone china, sterling flatware, crimson napkins folded into perfect crowns. If you didn't know better, you'd think this was a celebration. In a way, it was, just not for them. At 3 sharp, the front door opened. Laughter floated down the marble hall, brittle and bright like glass ornaments, moments from shattering. They came bearing gifts in glossy bags, tributes for a queen they believed was stepping down. Lucas arrived first, his lawyer's swagger intact, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Sarah clung to his arm like a designer accessory, her diamond tennis bracelet winking in the light. Amelia swept in next, a vision in cream cashmere, her husband trailing behind like a man permanently benched in his own marriage. Ryan sauntered last, reeking of expensive cologne and entitlement, Jessica at his side, perfect as a porcelain doll. Mother Lucas said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. His tone held that patronizing warmth reserved for elderly clients too stubborn to sign power of attorney. You look spectacular. I smiled a small, inscrutable curve of lips. Thank you, darling. You all look exactly as I expected. They laughed, uneasily. Dinner unfolded like theater scripted pleasantries, brittle compliments, laughter pitched a shade too high. I poured wine-refilled plates, played my role with Oscar-worthy grace, and all the while the envelopes waited in my clutch like coiled vipers. It was during dessert the chocolate torte Charles once claimed was worth surviving marriage for that Lucas Rose. The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to lean in. Before we finished, he began, voice smooth as courtroom silk. There's something we've all agreed on, something important for the future. He glanced at his siblings who nodded in tight formation. Then his gaze cut to me, cold and final. Mother, we think it's time you considered a transition. This house, your finances, they've become a lot to manage. We've researched options that would ensure your comfort and safety. And your control, I murmured just loud enough. Lucas blinked. Excuse me. I set down my fork, folded my napkin with surgical precision, and rose. My heels clicked against the hardwood like a metronome counting down to execution. Without a word, I reached into my clutch and withdrew 3 envelopes, heavy gold, sealed with crimson wax, bearing my monogram. I laid them in front of each child with the solemnity of a priest offering last rites. If we're making announcements, I said softly, I have one too. They stared at the envelopes as if expecting them to detonate. In a sense, they would. What is this? Amelia asked, her lacquered nails tracing the wax seal. A gift, I replied. Since we're exchanging roles tonight, I thought it only fair you leave with something memorable. Mother Lucas said, lawyerly steel creeping into his tone. If this is about Thanksgiving, open them, I said. My voice held the chill of glacial ice. All of you, at once. The room pulsed with silence, thick enough to choke on. Then the tearing began, paper ripping, wax cracking, breaths hitching. I watched their faces as they scanned the contents, shock, confusion, dawning horror. It bloomed like a slow-motion explosion, painting their features in shades of disbelief. Amelia's shriek sliced the air. First a feral sound that sent her children scrambling from the table. Ryan cursed so violently the crystal goblets rattled. Lucas didn't speak at all. He just stood there, the color draining from his face, until he looked like a man carved from marble, clutching the evidence of his own destruction. Sarah leaned over Lucas's shoulder, her manicured hand flying to her mouth as her eyes devoured the words. Oh my God, she whispered. Tell me this isn't real. But it was. Every page, every notarized signature, every photograph, every damning line of legal text, real and irrevocable. Lucas's envelope contained 5 gifts. 1. DNA test results confirming he shared zero biological relation to me. 2. A dossier of his embezzlement schemes complete with bank statements, casino markers, and sworn affidavits. 3. A formal complaint filed with the Bar Association guaranteeing disbarment proceedings. 4. A warrant application for financial fraud pending execution within 48 hours. 5. A letter from James and Margaret Blackwood, the grandparents he never knew existed, expressing their hope for reunion now that the truth was out. Amelia's package was equally lethal. Proof of her forged signatures on education fund checks. Photos of her sunbathing in Cabo with her trainer. A copy of the divorce petition her husband would file tomorrow, citing adultery and financial misconduct. Notice of an impending IRS audit, courtesy of a tip I personally delivered. Ryan's envelope, a masterpiece of devastation. Evidence of his cocaine distribution network. Shell company registrations tying him to laundering operations. Screenshots of incriminating texts. Key, and for the pièce de résistance, a USB drive containing audio of him bragging in a Denver bar about how easy it was to manipulate the old cow into funding his empire. "You can't do this," Lucas rasped, finally, voice raw. "You can't just erase us. Can I?" I lifted my champagne flute, the bubbles winking like tiny blades. "The court disagrees. The adoption was based on fraud. Your father lied about everything. Your origins, your mother, the custody battle he obliterated with perjury and bribes. Legally, I was never your parent. Emotionally, I let the word hang like smoke. That was your choice. We'll fight this," Amelia spat mascara streaking like war paint. "We'll contest every with what money my smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets seized. You're all one phone call away from orange jumpsuits. And don't bother threatening me. I've already secured restraining orders. Any attempt to contact me will land you in jail faster than your warrants." Ryan slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "You think this ends with some paperwork and a few envelopes? You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, darling," I said, my voice like silk over steel. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. 3 spoiled adults who mistook dependency for power, who thought love was a credit line without limits, who forgot the first rule of survival." I leaned in, my eyes boring into his. "Never bite the hand that built your world, because sometimes that hand bites back." The room imploded, shouts, sobs, the metallic clatter of cutlery hitting porcelain. Sarah was on her phone hissing into the receiver, probably calling lawyers who wouldn't pick up. Amelia clutched her children, mascara dripping like ink. Ryan paced like a caged animal, veins pulsing in his neck. I finished my champagne, set the flute down with surgical precision, and reached for my clutch. "One more thing," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. "Your real grandparents are waiting for your call. Their number's in your envelope. They've been searching for you for 30 years. Maybe they'll give you the unconditional love you mistook for entitlement." I paused at the doorway, surveying the wreckage, 3 adults gutted by the truth, spouses crumbling in collateral damage, grandchildren blinking through a fog of confusion. "Merry Christmas," I said softly. "Consider this my final gift, freedom. From me. From the lie you've been living. From the illusion that blood or the absence of it entitles you to anything." And then I walked out, my heels slicing through the silence like punctuation marks on the last sentence of a 30-year sentence. Behind me, the screaming began anew, rising like a requiem for a dynasty that had just burned to ash. The hotel suite smelled like lilies and victory. I'd checked into the Ritz an hour after leaving my house, a house that wasn't mine anymore, a house I'd gutted like a battlefield and left smoldering in screams. The concierge greeted me by name. The bellman whisked away my luggage, whispering "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Davenport," as though he sensed the quiet war I'd just won. Upstairs, the suite was everything my old life wasn't: sleek, modern, unapologetically mine. No mahogany furniture. Charles chose no oil portraits of people I'd raised who turned me into a cash machine. Just clean lines, white orchids, and a view of Denver glittering under the winter sky. I kicked off my heels, poured champagne, and stepped onto the balcony. Below the city pulsed with holiday cheer, families clinking glasses, lovers skating hand in hand, children squealing in snow. Somewhere across town, my former children were watching their lives detonate in real time lawyers, hanging up bank accounts, frozen reputations shredded across social media. I felt nothing, no guilt, no triumph, just clarity. For 30 years, I begged for scraps of affection, convinced that family was sacred, that motherhood was martyrdom. But here's the truth no one tells you. Love without respect is just leverage waiting to be weaponized, and tonight I finally disarmed them. The first call came at 11:47 p.m. Lucas, I let it ring. The second came 5 minutes later, Amelia, then Ryan. I ignored them all, watching their names flash across the screen like ghosts clawing at a locked door. By midnight, my voicemail was full, pleas curdling into threats, threats collapsing into sobs. I muted the phone and raised my glass to the only person who'd shown me real loyalty tonight me. The next morning, I woke to silence. No breakfast orders from spoiled adults, masquerading as children, no passive-aggressive texts questioning my spending, just sunlight spilling through glass walls and the smell of room service coffee strong enough to resurrect the dead. Margaret called first. They're in free fall, she reported, voice brisk with professional satisfaction. IRS has Amelia on radar. DEA wants to talk to Ryan. And Lucas, well, the Bar Association moves slow, but they've already opened a file. And the Blackwoods, I asked. They're ecstatic. Said they'll wait as long as it takes. They sent a Christmas card for you, by the way. Handwritten. I pictured two people in their 80s clasping each other's hands over a kitchen table, worn soft by decades of waiting their hope finally vindicated. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, my throat tightened. Not for Lucas, Amelia, or Ryan, but for the grandparents who never stopped believing in love, even when the law failed them. By New Year's Eve, the news broke. Davenport dynasty collapses in scandal. Headlines devoured the story like wolves on raw meat. My phone buzzed with media requests, talk shows offering six-figure exclusives, publishers dangling book deals. I ignored them all for now. Some stories deserve timing as sharp as their truth. Instead, I focused on something infinitely more radical myself. I signed papers selling the house within 48 hours cash, offer no contingencies. I donated the furniture, the art, the silver flatware that once gleamed under chandeliers, now as obsolete as the people who used them. Watching that moving truck pull away felt like exhaling poison I didn't know I'd been breathing for decades. 3 weeks later, I boarded a plane to Maine. Bar Harbor in winter is a study in contrast, tourists gone, the sea steel gray, and furious the air tasting of salt and secrets. I bought a Victorian overlooking Frenchman Bay, a house with bones older than every lie Charles ever told me. 12 rooms, a turret library, a wraparound porch that catches the sunrise like a chalice of fire. The locals whispered, at first. The Davenport woman, the one from the scandal. Let them whisper. I wasn't hiding anymore. In fact, I was blooming. Slowly, defiantly, like a rose through frost. Rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was psychological excavation. I started small. Morning walks along the shore path, waves gnashing at rocks like beasts with broken teeth. Afternoons painting watercolors of winter light bleeding across the Atlantic. Evenings by the hearth, reading novels I never had time for when my life was one long emergency room for other people's bad decisions. I learned the sublime difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone was coffee steaming in silence, fire crackling like applause just for me. Alone was power clean undiluted and finally mine. Lonely was what I felt for 30 years at a mahogany table surrounded by mouths that only opened to devour me. By spring, I had a ritual sunrise coffee, mid-morning yoga afternoons, drafting the book that would become my war hymn. Working title, The Last Supper, How I Buried a Bloodline and Saved Myself. Every chapter was a blade carving out rot, laying truth bare for women drowning in the same syrup of guilt and obligation I once mistook for love. Margaret read the first draft and sent 3 words: make it sharper. So I did. Summer brought invitations, gallery openings, charity galas, but I preferred the company of people who knew me as Victoria, not the woman who nuked her family. Martha, the bookstore owner, who slipped me first editions like contraband. Helen, the gallery curator, who coaxed me into exhibiting my watercolors. Dr. Patricia Wells, retired psychiatrist who walked with me along the cliffs and taught me the language of boundaries like scripture. One foggy morning, Patricia asked, "Do you miss them?" I thought about Lucas's cold eyes, Amelia's clipped tone, Ryan's smirk. Then I thought about the Blackwoods, their cracked voices trembling with hope when I called. "No," I said finally. "I miss the people I thought they were, but those people never existed." Patricia nodded as if I'd passed some unspoken test. "Then you're free." Freedom tasted like salt air and possibility. It tasted like wiring funds for a women's shelter instead of bailing out Ryan's latest business venture. It tasted like commissioning a bronze plaque for my library that read, "Survival is the sweetest revenge." By fall, the memoir was done. Publishers fought over it like jackals. I chose the one who promised no edits to the ending, a line I wrote in a single unbroken breath. They told me blood is thicker than water, but ink is thicker than both, especially when it's on a restraining order. The book dropped in spring, detonating like a grenade in America's cultural conversation. Morning shows dissected it. Podcasts canonized it. Women wrote me letters, thousands of them confessing the chains they'd snapped after reading my story. One line appeared in message after message: "You gave me permission." And here's the paradox of burning bridges: you think the fire will consume you, but sometimes it lights the road you were always meant to walk. 2 years after that Christmas night, I sat on my porch in Bar Harbor, the Atlantic spitting diamonds under a lavender sky. My phone buzzed a number I knew by heart but hadn't dialed in years. Amelia. I let it ring until the screen went black. Then I whispered my nightly prayer, the one that began as vengeance and became benediction. "Thank you for leaving me. Thank you for setting me free." The wind carried it out to sea, where endings dissolve and new worlds begin. The ocean was restless that night, hurling itself against the black rocks like a lover scorned. From my porch, the spray glittered under a swollen moon, each wave a heartbeat echoing against the cliffs. I wrapped a wool shawl around my shoulders and sipped bourbon from a crystal glass, watching the Atlantic breathe its eternal rhythm. It felt fitting, because tonight marked 3 years since I walked out of my old life without looking back. People think revenge tastes sweet. They're wrong. Revenge tastes clean like cold water after choking on smoke, like oxygen flooding lungs that forgot how to breathe. That's what freedom feels like after decades drowning in obligation, masquerading as love. I thought about that night in Denver, the dining table gleaming under chandeliers, the weight of those gold envelopes in my hand, the tremor of anticipation in my bones as I slid them across polished mahogany. I thought about their faces cracking open as the truth spilled out, the betrayals they thought were hidden, the bloodlines they never questioned, the empire they assumed was theirs disintegrating between their manicured fingers. But here's the part. No one asks about what happens after the storm, when the headlines fade, when the lawyers retreat, when silence stretches out like an endless road. What does a woman do when she's finally alone with the life she burned down to save herself? I'll tell you, she builds something better, not from the ashes of what was, but from the steel of what survived. The first year was raw. My hands shook the first time I signed a check for something that wasn't for them. I cried in the grocery store aisle when no one called to demand my time, my energy, my soul. Freedom is intoxicating, yes, but it's also disorienting, like stepping off a ship after decades at sea and realizing the ground doesn't move anymore. The second year bloomed. I planted roses along the cliff edge, their roots clutching stone like lifelines. I learned watercolor, capturing the violent beauty of winter tides. I wrote the book, the one they said I'd never finish because I'd never start. The one that became a lifeline for women chained by the golden handcuffs of family guilt. Every chapter was a blade slicing through silence, every page a match struck against generational lies. The third year, that was the year I stopped surviving and started living. The house became more than walls. It became a manifesto in wood and glass, every room declaring, "You were right to choose yourself." The library smelled of old paper and victory, lined with books I read not to escape, but to expand. The studio overflowed with canvases, storm-dark seas, blood-red sunsets, fragments of a soul, pieced back together in color. People often ask if I forgave them. My answer never changes. Forgiveness isn't about freeing them. It's about unshackling yourself from the rusted chains of resentment. I forgave not because they deserved it, but because I did. Because carrying their betrayal was like drinking poison and expecting them to choke. Do I miss them sometimes? But I've learned to separate nostalgia from reality. I miss the idea of family, the Sunday dinners, the laughter, the illusion that love could outlast greed. But ideas don't bleed you dry. People do. And when people show you who they are, believe them the first time or the 400th if you're as stubborn as I was. Last month, I received a letter postmarked from a women's prison in Connecticut. It was from Amelia. No manipulation this time, no bargaining, just ink and truth. "You were right," she wrote. "Not just about me, but about all of us. We treated you like a safety net instead of a mother. We confused your love for weakness and your sacrifices for obligation. You deserve better than us. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you found the peace we never gave you." I read it twice. Then I lit a match and fed it to the fire. Some closures belong to flames. Here's what I know. Now, blood is biology. Family is behavior. And love, real love, isn't a debt to collect or a weapon to wield. It's a choice renewed daily by people who see you as more than what you can give them. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. You do not owe anyone access to your life simply because they share your DNA. Obligation is not affection. Endurance is not virtue. And martyrdom is not motherhood. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away before they burn you alive and call it love. Tonight the tide is high, the wind savage, and the sky split with stars. I raise my glass to the woman I used to be, the one who mistook chains for bracelets, who gave and gave until her name became a currency. She died at that Christmas table, and I do not mourn her, because from her bones I built this a life ungoverned by guilt, uncluttered by people who confuse love with leverage. And if you're listening to this wondering whether you're allowed to do the same, let me answer the question you're too afraid to ask. Yes, you're allowed. Allowed to choose peace over performance, self-respect over self-immolation, truth over the fragile theater of family. And if the world calls you ruthless, wear it like a crown. Because survival, my darling, is the most exquisite form of grace. As midnight tips into tomorrow, I step out onto the porch, the Atlantic roaring like applause at the edge of the earth. The air tastes of salt and something sweeter, sovereignty. I whisper the words that became my benediction the night I walked away. Thank you for leaving me. Thank you for setting me free. The wind catches them, carrying them beyond the black horizon where endings become beginnings. And every woman learns that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to walk away. Fade to black. What I learned and what I need you to hear is this: family is not defined by blood, but by behavior. Love that demands your silence isn't love, it's control. Loyalty that only flows one way isn't loyalty, it's exploitation. For years, I thought being a good mother meant sacrificing everything, even my dignity, to keep the illusion of family alive. But here's the truth. Self-sacrifice is a slow form of suicide when no one values what you're given. Love without respect becomes leverage, and the longer you let people take from you without accountability, the more they believe they're entitled to everything you have, even your soul. Walking away wasn't easy, it was brutal, but so is living as a hostage in your own life. And in that choice, I discovered something astonishing. Peace doesn't come from holding on. It comes from letting go of people who would rather watch you drown than learn to swim themselves. If you're in a toxic dynamic, whether with children, parents, or anyone who bleeds you dry, start by setting one non negotiable boundary. It can be as simple as saying, "No, I can't do that for you," and holding that line without apology. Watch their reaction. People who truly love you will respect it. People who don't will rage, manipulate, and call you selfish. Here's the secret: their anger is proof the boundary was necessary. Document everything, protect your assets. And remember, distance is not cruelty when closeness means destruction. Choosing yourself isn't betrayal, it's survival. And survival is the foundation of every new beginning.